Elijah looked out over the crowd as they trudged up the slopes of Mount Carmel. Even in dim light of the early morning, the poverty and want afflicting these people were plain to see. The drought, 3.5 years long, had left its mark on them. Among them strutted the 450 prophets of Baal that we talked about in our last talk, full of pride and burning hatred for Elijah, God's prophet. Queen Jezebel had executed many of God's prophets, but this man still stood firm against Baal and Baal worship. But for how long? Perhaps those priests, the 450 prophets, and reasoned that a lone man could never prevail against all of them. The king Ahab had also come, riding in his royal chariot, and he too bore no love for Elijah. Ahead of that solitary prophet lay a day like no other in his life. As Elijah watched, the stage was being set for one of the most dramatic confrontations between good and evil that the world has ever seen. And how did he feel when that day dawned? Well, he was not impervious to fear, being a man with feelings like our own. We could be sure, at least, of this, that he was surrounded by the faithless people and their apostate king and murderous priests. Elijah keenly felt that he probably was alone. What though had brought Israel to this crisis, and what does this account have to do with us today? Well, consider Elijah's example of faith and how practical it can be for us today. For much of his life, Elijah had helplessly watched as the best thing about his homeland and his people was pushed aside and trampled underfoot. You see, Israel was in the grip of a long struggle, a war between pure religion and false religion, between the worship of God and the idolatry of the surrounding nations. In Elijah's day, that struggle had taken an especially ugly turn. King Ahab had deeply offended God. He married Jezebel, which is the daughter of the king of Sidon, and Jezebel was determined to spread Baal worship in the land of Israel and to eradicate true worship of God. Ahab quickly fell under her influence. He built a temple and an altar to Baal, and he took the lead in bowing down to the pagan god himself. So what made Baal worship so offensive? Well, it seduced Israel, luring many away from the true God. It was also disgusting and brutal religion. It involved male and female temple prostitution, sexual orgies, even sacrifice of children. And God responded by sending Elijah to Ahab to announce a drought that would last until God's prophet had proclaimed its end. So several years passed before Elijah showed himself to Ahab and told him to gather the people and the Baal prophets to Mount Carmel. God's prophet Elijah had announced to King Ahab that the long drought would end soon, and that happened in the third year, evidently counting from the day that Elijah first announced the drought. God sent rain soon after Elijah said that he would, and some might conclude that the drought ended during the course of its third year, and that it was therefore less than 3 years long. However, both Jesus and James tells us that the drought lasted 3 years and 6 months. I just want to clear up that this isn't a contradiction. You see, the dry season in ancient Israel was quite long and could last up to 6 months. So no doubt Elijah came to Ahab to announce the drought when the dry season was already proving to be unusually long and severe. In effect, the drought had begun nearly half a year earlier. Thus, when Elijah announced the end of the drought in the third year from his previous announcement, the drought had already lasted nearly 3.5 years, or the full 3 years and 6 months had elapsed by the time all the people had assembled to witness the great test on Mount Carmel. There's that test we're going to look at today. So consider then the timing of Elijah's first visit to Ahab. The people believed that Baal was the rider of the clouds, the god who would bring rains to end the dry season. If the dry season was unusually long, people likely wondered, well, where is Baal? When will he bring the rains? Elijah's announcing that neither rain nor dew would occur until he said, so it must have been devastating to all of those Baal worshippers. What, though, does this struggle mean for us today? Well, some might assume that a story about Baal worship is irrelevant today, since we do not see temples or altars to Baal around us. But the account is not mere ancient history. The word Baal means owner or master. And God told his people that they should choose him over their Baal, or husbandly owner. So would you not agree that people still serve a variety of masters other than God Almighty today? Whether people use their life in the service of money, career, recreation, sexual pleasure, or any of the countless gods that are worshipped instead of the true God. They choose a master. In a sense, the most potent elements that characterized Baal worship are thriving today, reflecting on that ancient contest between God and Baal can help us to make a wise choice, I think, about whom we shall serve. So let's look at this test. The heights of Mount Carmel commanded a sweeping view from the torrent valley of Kishon below to the Great Sea, which we know as the Mediterranean Sea, nearby, and to the mountains of Lebanon on the far northern horizon. Mount Carmel is usually lush and green as moisture-laden winds from the sea rise along its slopes, frequently depositing rains and plentiful dew. But because Baal was credited with bringing rain, this mount was evidently an important site for Baal worship. However, a barren and dry Carmel thus made an ideal spot to expose Baalism as a fraud. But as the sun rose on this climatic day, the vista was grim. A deathly pall hung over the once fertile land that God had given to the children of Abraham. That just really paints a picture of how desolate the land had become. It was now a land that had been baked hard by the merciless sun and ruined by the folly of God's own people. As those people thronged, Elijah approached them and said, "How long will you be limping upon two different opinions? If God is the true God, go following him. But if Baal is, go following him." Now, what did Elijah mean by this expression, limping upon two different opinions? Well, those people did not realize that they had to choose between the worship of God and the worship of Baal. They thought that they could have their cake and eat it. They thought they could have it both ways, that they could appease Baal with their revolting rituals and still ask favors of God. Perhaps they reasoned that Baal would bless their crops and herds while the God of armies would protect them in battle. They'd forgotten a basic truth, and one that still eludes many people today, is that God does not share his worship with anyone. He demands and is worthy of exclusive devotion. Any worship of him that is mixed with some other form of worship is unacceptable to him, even offensive. So those Israelites were limping along like a man trying to follow two pathways at once. Many people today make a similar mistake, allowing other Baals to creep into their life and push aside the worship of God. Heeding Elijah's clarion call to stop limping can help us to re-examine our own priorities and our own worship. So the test, we're finally going to get to the test. Elijah proposed a test, and it was simplicity itself. Basically, the Baal priests were to set up an altar to Baal and lay out a sacrifice on it, and then they were to pray to their God to light the fire, and Elijah would do the same. He said that the God that answers by fire is the true God. Elijah well knew who was the true God, so strong was his faith that he did not hesitate to give the opponents every advantage. He let the Baal prophets go first, so they chose their bull for sacrifice, and then they approached Baal in prayer and worship and all the rest of it. Well, Notably, Elijah told them, "You must not put fire to the sacrifice." Scholars say that such idolaters sometimes used altars with a secret cavity beneath so that the fire could appear to be lit supernaturally. Well, we do not live in an age of miracles, however, God has not changed. We can be just as confident in Him as Elijah was. For instance, when others disagree with what the Bible teaches, we need not fear to let them go ahead and have their say. Elijah, like Elijah, we can look on to the true God to just settle the matter. We do not need to argue. God can settle the matter. We do that by relying not on ourselves but on His inspired word, which is designed for setting things straight. There's an answer to most questions in that book. I've not yet found the answer in the Bible to how long is a piece of string, but I'll keep looking. The Baal prophets proceeded then to set up their sacrifice and call on their God. And, "Oh, Baal, answer us," they cried again and again. And they kept it as the minutes and then the hours passed by. But there was no voice and there was no one answering. The Bible says that at noon, Elijah began to mock them, asserting sarcastically that Baal must be too busy to answer them, or that he was relieving himself in the privy, perhaps, or that he was napping and someone needed to wake him up. So, call at the top of your voice, Elijah urged the charlatans. And clearly he saw this Baal worship as ridiculous fakery, and he wanted God's people to see it for the fraud that it was. In response, the Baal priests became even more frenzied, calling at the top of their voices and cutting themselves according to their custom with daggers and lances, and until they caused blood to flow out upon them, and it was all to no avail. There was still no voice, there was still no one answering, and there was no paying of attention. Indeed, there was no Baal. He was an invention designed by Satan to lure people away from God, and the truth is, choosing any master other than God leads to disappointment, even shame. So what about the answer then? Well, late in the afternoon came Elijah's turn to offer a sacrifice. So he repaired an altar to God that had been torn down, no doubt by enemies of pure worship, maybe even by Jezebel herself. He used 12 stones, perhaps reminding many in the 10-tribe nation of Israel that the law given to all 12 tribes was still binding on them. And then he laid out a sacrifice and had everything doused with water, possibly obtained from the Mediterranean Sea nearby. And he even dug a trench around the altar and filled it with water, just as he had given the prophets of Baal every advantage, he gave God every disadvantage. Such was his confidence in God. When everything was ready, Elijah said a prayer, eloquent in its simplicity. The prayer showed clearly where Elijah's priorities lay. First and foremost, he wanted it known that God, not this Baal, was God in Israel. Second, he wanted everyone to know that his own role was that of God's servant, and that all glory and credit should go to God. And finally, he showed that he still cared about his people, for he was eager to see God turn their heart back. Despite all the misery that they had caused by their service, by their severe faithlessness, Elijah still loved them, and in our own prayers to God, we can manifest similar humility and concern for God's name, and compassion for others who need help. Before Elijah's prayer, the crowds there might have wondered if God would turn out to be an empty lie, as Baal had proved to be. But after the prayer, though, there was no time for wondering. The account says that at that the fire of God came falling and went eating up the burnt offering and the pieces of wood and the stones and the dust and the water that was in the trench. It licked up. Oh, what a spectacular answer. And how did the people respond? Well, they simply said, "God is the true God. God is the true God." All of them cried it out. At last, they saw the truth. However, they had not as yet shown any faith. Frankly, to admit that God is the true God after seeing fire fall from heaven in response to a prayer is not an impressive demonstration of faith. So Elijah asked more of them. He asked them to do what they should have done many years earlier, and that is obey the law of God. And God's law said that false prophets and idolaters should be put to death, and the Baal priests were committed enemies of God, and they deliberately worked against his purposes. Did they deserve mercy? Well, what mercy had they ever granted to all those innocent children who were burned alive as sacrifices to Baal? Those men were well beyond the reach of mercy, so Elijah ordered that they be executed, and executed they were. Modern day critics may decreed a conclusion to this test on Mount Carmel. Some people may worry lest religious zealots use it to justify violent acts of religious intolerance. Sadly, there are many violent religious fanatics today, thinking primarily of ISIS. However, Elijah was no fanatic. He was acting on God's behalf in a just execution. Furthermore, genuine Christians know that they cannot follow Elijah's course in taking a sword to the wicked. Rather, they follow the standard for all disciples of Jesus, as found in Christ's words to Peter, that says, "Return your sword to its place, for all those who take the sword will perish by the sword." God will use his Son to carry out divine justice in the future. The responsibility then of a true Christian is to lead a life of faith, and one way to do so is to imitate faithful men like Elijah. He worshipped God exclusively, and he urged others to do the same. He boldly exposed as a fraudulent a religion that Satan used to lure people away from God, and he trusted God to settle matters instead of relying on his own abilities and his own will. Elijah stood up for pure worship. May all of us imitate his faith and do the same. Until next time, God bless you. Amen.